episode of Quake It Up, I want to look at what Quakerism actually is. Is it a denomination? Is it a sect? Is it a cult? Is it any of these things? Or is it none of these things? And perhaps most of all, does any of that actually matter? When discussing Quakerism with anyone who isn't a Quaker, quite often the question that comes is, what are they? And this can be quite a difficult question to answer. As I've said in other videos, some that within Quakerism, Quakers themselves are quite diverse in what they think or what they believe they are part of. Um, some might be very happy in describing themselves as Christian and would fit in line with other Christian denominations. Some would say that they would fit, they are Protestant. Others who don't identify with the Christian origins of Quakerism anymore might say they don't belong to Christianity at all. Um, so it becomes very hard to define, especially within Christian rubric, what Quakerism actually is. I've had people who, when talking about Quakerism, would say, "Are you part of a sect? Or is it a cult?" Or things like that. People are aware that there's something different about Quakerism, but they're not quite sure how to define it. And to be honest, Quakers are never really in a good position to start defining things anyway, so that doesn't help. I think another way where there's certain amount of confusion that comes into this is by the name, the formal name of Quakers itself. So the formal name is the Religious Society of Friends. Um, and so people think, okay, so what does that mean? And again, I'm like, could mean many a thing. And so what I thought I'd do in this video is I've got a descriptions and a checklist of a church, of a denomination, of a cult, and a sect. And I thought it'd be interesting to see where Quakerism today falls in on that lines. And I say today because I think, well, clearly Quakerism has changed in its 300, 400 years of existence. And I think early Quakerism and the quietist period of Quakerism might fall in very different categories than when I'm talking about modern Quakerism today. So I'm going to be looking at modern British Quakerism and we'll take it from there. So the criteria that I'm going to be looking at to separate these four things, so church, denomination, sect, and cult, are going to be membership size, commitment levels, the monopoly over truth, its organizational form, the relationship to the state and mainstream society. So in terms of membership size, so the way that this is put out is that you have the largest in terms of membership size being the church, being a church, so that if you have many millions of members, you would be considered a church. If you have 10 members, then the smallest would be the sect. So it go church, denomination, cult, sect. Um, Now, as is well known, the Quakerism throughout the world is not very large. There are hundreds of thousands of Quakers, but that still, pales in comparison to Catholics and other major church denominations in the Christian tradition. So I would say it would be considered small, which would fit into this distinction as being a sect. So if we move then on to commitment levels, I think what they're trying to get at here is the idea of how much of yourself, your free time, your life, I suppose, do you have to commit to the body. And so they have church being low commitment and inclusive membership, denominations higher commitment than a church and more exclusive membership. The sects would have a highest commitment and very exclusive membership, and the cult would be the other way around, so a low commitment and a very inclusive membership. So on this one, I think we have to look at Quakerism today, as I said in previous versions of Quakerism throughout history, this might be slightly different. I suppose on the idea of membership, the idea would be that you, um, well, for example, I am not officially a member of the Religious Society of Friends. I am what they would call an attender, and yet I can do within my local meeting, I can do pretty much anything that a member can do. I just haven't yet become a full member of the religious society. Um, and so I suppose on that level, I would probably say it's probably a low commitment. So similar to either the church on one hand or the cult on the other. It is not like a sect where you are membership is very much exclusive and you're part of a an elite few and a chosen few. Literally anyone can go over to a Quaker meeting and have as much say as anyone else. They can give ministry in exactly the same way. They can partake as fully as any full members. They can go along to business meetings if they want to. There is no difference there. In terms of commitment, I think that's a weird question. So I mean, they say that churches have low commitment, denominations higher commitment, and the sects have the highest commitment. I think with this, I mean, I think you can play that many ways. I mean, I think in terms of how Quaker is being a Quaker permeates through to your daily life, I suppose that could be it depends, I suppose, what the how the inner light has moved, what has encouraged you to do or led you to do. If it has led you to live a life where you are constantly in charitable work, that you're constantly protesting for a better quality of living and things like that, then I'd say that's high commitment. Would I say that's every Quaker? I wouldn't say so. So I suppose for Quakerism there, and to be honest, I think that's quite a difficult one for any church body to really gauge. Um, I think that's a hard one. The next one is monopoly of truth. And so, what I'm taking that to mean is that the level of which truth can be found outside of the body. So, for example, um, if you can, does your body have everything that there is that you need to understand truth? Um, so they would say that church says yes, denominations say no, and I'm guessing the reason why they're saying no there is because, for example, um, uh, you could say that as an Anglican, you believe that you have access to the truth, but you wouldn't deny that a Lutheran would as well. You have might have more, might have less. You might do it in a different way, but I don't think you would deny the fact that a Lutheran has access to the fullness of truth. Um, they would say that sects say yes and cults say no. And I suppose they'd say that in this, they would say that cults say no because maybe they're very specific as to what they're believing in, or maybe they are taking influences from loads of different things. So for Quakerism, then, I think uh, certainly over the last century and the influence of other religions on Quakerism and the acceptance of universalism into British liberal Quakerism, this has become less of a monopoly of the truth insofar as that the influences as to where truth can come from. But I think this fits in very nicely with the idea of Quakerism being fundamentally about truth. One of the first names for Quakers before they got labeled Quakers were the publishers of truth. Quakers have always been very interested in the idea of truth, the idea that you don't take oaths because that means that there are levels of truth. I'm telling you the truth now, but maybe I wouldn't have if had I not sworn an oath to do so. So, um, truth is fundamentally important to Quakerism. Going on from that, they would say that everyone has access to the truth. The inner light shines on everyone. Everyone has access to that truth. So that truth is universal. That truth, whatever you may call that, you could call that Jesus, you could call that the Word of God, you can call that the inner light, spirit, however. But that everyone has access to that truth. So there is a universality to it. But I wouldn't say that it is that people outside the Quaker tradition could also receive the fullness of truth. I think they would argue very much that you can everyone can have access to the truth. You don't need to necessarily have been a Quaker in order to have had that access. So I think they would say no, like the cult and like the denominations. So this is going to be an interesting one. So organizational form. You obviously have on one end a church and the cult on the other, with the church being formal, bureaucratic, hierarchical, profession, and with professionally paid clergy. And on the other hand, you have a cult which is loose knit networks, and not much of an absolutely no hierarchy. And denomination and sects somehow falling in the middle with the idea of a sect, maybe that might be based around an individual. So obviously Quakerism has a lot to say on that. It has prided itself on not being a hierarchical system. That there are no, certainly in the British Quaker tradition, there are no paid clergy. Everyone is a minister. Um, and they it is and every meeting has autonomy over its local business. It fits into an area meeting, which then fits into a larger a larger yearly meeting, but that is still very there's a lot of autonomy there. So it is certainly not formal. It is certainly not well, I, you may argue that it could be very bureaucratic. There's a committee for everything. However, probably not bureaucratic in what these definitions of meaning. Certainly not hierarchical, and certainly no professionally paid clergy. And right, going back to the beginning of Quakerism, that has always been the case. However, it is more loose knit. It sort of does fit in a lot more with the cult aspect of that. Moving on to relationship to the state. I suppose this is important because obviously, in terms of legitimacy, if the government legitimizes your body, then that makes you more important, and that's what it calls a church. So a church would be a close relationship with the state, perhaps even allied with the state, like the Church of England is here in England. A denomination would often be separate. The sect would sometimes be in conflict with the state, and a cult would generally be seen as apolitical. So I certainly wouldn't call the Quakers in any way apolitical. I think we're, in terms of a body, highly political. Just recently, the recording clerk of Britain Yearly Meeting was on state radio, talking about a law that's going to be that's being debated in the House of Lords at the moment. So and I know there have been loads of protests against this bill throughout the year. So definitely in no way apolitical like a cult. Although in the past, clearly Quakers have often been in conflict with the state. I don't think that has been the case for many years. So I don't think we could say that it's like a sect in terms of it's in combat with the state in any way, or in any meaningful way. I would say it probably fits here best as a denomination. It's separate. There are Quakers. There are currently two or three Quakers who are members of Parliament, but there's no formal connection like a church with Quakerism, so it would fit in with the denomination aspect, I suppose. And the last one then is relationship to mainstream society, and they would say that a church, a denomination, and a cult all accept mainstream values, whereas a sect would reject them. So this screams out to me the idea of the quietist period of Quakerism, where they rejected the world as they would call it, and they stuck very much to themselves and did not participate in society. That's when they had the hats. That's when they didn't intermarry and became very isolated as a people. So I suppose in terms of that, that's when they would definitely be seen more of as a sect. However, I think nowadays you would certainly find no Quaker who doesn't interact with the world, not with the idea that it's perfect or that mainstream society is great and we should embrace everything in it, but that it is only by going into it that we can hope to transform it, that we can hope to improve it, that we can hope to bring about the values which Quakerism upholds. Another way that I've seen of balancing or contrasting these different names that we have for these um, for calling these bodies is by looking at the idea of equilibrium versus protest. So you'd have things like sects and cults on the idea on the side of protest. You would have church on the idea of on the side of equilibrium, and you'd have denominations depending on how they separated from the church, um, further either further in or further away um, from protest. Obviously, this is an interesting way of calling it because obviously Protestantism would you would imagine very much be on the side of protest. However, if we're looking at it from a modern perspective, I wouldn't think that we would necessarily say that now. If we, especially if we consider, for example, the Anglican Church is a Protestant denomination. However, it is also the state church, so you can't really say that it is a protest church in any way anymore. How does this fit in with Quakerism then? So, well, again, I suppose depends what time period you're looking at. Yes, of course, like anything that separated from something else, it's always based on a protest of something. Um, and I've talked about the reasons why before. It was the idea of paid clergy. It was the idea of exclusive membership. The idea that um, that truth could only be found in the Bible and things like that. So the early Quakers were certainly protesting against things, and Quakers still today are protesting against, as I mentioned, um, injustices and anywhere where equality is being damaged. However, I don't think that's quite what it means. I think it's protesting from other forms or the religious bodies, and I don't think really that Quakers are really doing that anymore. And today there are what you could call hyphenated Quakers, where there are um, hybrid Quakers who are maybe culturally Catholic or culturally Buddhist or culturally whatever, but also now attend Quaker meetings. So um, I don't think this is an idea of protest anymore. I think it is equilibrium, but maybe not in the original sense that that this differentiation was looking at. It's an inclusive equilibrium rather maybe than just one way of looking at it. Quakerism is opening up and looking at the whole truth and the whole expression of the truth, no matter where it is. So it's a maybe more plural equilibrium than maybe was first intended with this. So I'm just adding that up, and it does look that if I'm just saying which one of these categories Quakerism seems to mostly fit in with, it does seem to mostly fit in with a cult. And how does that make me feel? Well, I think ultimately it doesn't make me it feel very good because I think cults has a very negative um, stigma, um, especially in the West. You know, if you said that you've joined a cult, then there's something wrong with you. Um, I know that I've having looked into this, there are um, cults, I suppose, if you want to call them that, who now call themselves things like new religious movements and things like that, to try and get away from this idea of a cult, because I don't think anyone that's wanting to attract people anymore into joining a religious movement would ever consider um, it under the name of cult. And so I don't think ultimately these words are very useful, especially not to describe something as plural as Quakerism. I don't think you can nail it down to one specific thing. I mean, these are Christian terminologies as well. I mean, is that even really valid? But I think if at the end of the day, if you go to the Quakers in Britain website, they say that Quakerism came out of the Christian tradition or that they have a Christian heritage. And I think that's definitely true. When I was first looking into Quakerism, I found that phrase really annoying and difficult because I wanted someone just to tell me what Quakerism was so I could tell whether or not I liked it or not. Um, but again, I think that's wrong because I think you can't put words on things all the time and expect to know precisely what that is. I think that's what a lot of our society is about, like labeling things and putting people into groups and therefore being able to understand what they are. But some things just don't fit in that model. And I think as I've understood this more and I've looked into it more, I don't actually care what it is, so long as it's about seeking truth. I also think on the idea of I don't know, when someone says a sect to me, it sounds like a bit of maybe a religious fad. Like it's something that people are going to because it's the new cool religious thing to do, and won't necessarily last. It'll fall apart because it's related to maybe one particular group or focus too much on one particular thing. I don't think that is at all true of Quakerism, insofar as that it's not focused on one particular thing. It's open to quite a lot of different things, and obviously it has been surviving for nearly 400 years. So calling it a sect on that level also doesn't really seem to calling it a cult on that level doesn't also seem to fit in. So I think ultimately, as I said, I thought it was interesting because it's one of those things which is really hard to do, describing Quakerism to other people, because it's not like many other things that the unknowing passerby will necessarily be able to relate it to. But that's the beauty of it. So no, do I think that Quakerism is a cult? No, I don't. I don't think that is a very useful way of talking about things. That being said, maybe religious society can also be misconstrued as well. Maybe there is no good way of describing a group of religious people. Um, uh, and is that really a problem? I don't think that always is, actually. And actually, labeling things like this, I don't think actually ever I don't think any good ever really comes from that. It's nice to have an idea of a community, of a society, but I think if you are, again, labeling people, putting things in categories, that people start to assume things about you and about what you believe, when these are just words that are used to define and differentiate different groups of people, and not actually look at on a case by case basis what their beliefs actually are, and looking at them in all seriousness and looking for the truth within what they're trying to say. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you liked it, please do click on the thumbs up button, and do check out some of my other videos about Quakerism in the UK. If you want to keep up to date with the latest videos, please do remember to subscribe as well. It really helps. Thank you.